Take off the hat, old man. You don't deserve to wear it. The voice was rough, dripping with contempt, echoing under the blinding sunlight of a roadside gas station. The faded Marine Corps cap froze midair. An old, weathered hand gripped the younger man's wrist, not trembling, but cold. 5 young men astride their Harleys burst into laughter, their engines roaring loud enough to drown out the heartbeat of anyone watching. Before them stood only an aging veteran, silver-haired, moving slowly with a wooden cane. None of them knew that beneath that worn jacket lay a scar from Da Nang, 1968, and a pair of eyes that had stared into death without a sound. But when another man stepped through the glass door and removed his dark shades, the air itself seemed to stop. No one spoke again. Because those eyes had seen battlefields they could never even imagine, and the 4 words he spoke next made the entire gang fall silent. If you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have already walked through war, then subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and join us in preserving the memory, dignity, and reverence for our quiet heroes. Frank stood upright. His shadow stretched long across the oil-stained concrete. His breathing was steady, short, each exhale curling into the noon heat, like smoke dissolving in sunlight. His hand reached for the wooden cane that had been kicked away. His fingers trembling not from fear, but from the old wound in Da Nang flaring alive again. The cane lay a few steps away, turning slowly in the wind, tapping against the pavement. Frank bent down, brushed the dust off, and picked it up. A simple movement, yet it made the air around him grow thick and heavy. No words, no glance returned. Only the whistle of wind around the gas pumps, and the faint rustle of the American flag above, swaying in rhythm with the breath of a man who had survived more shell fire than all those before him combined. Behind the counter, the young cashier held his breath. The cup of coffee in his hand trembled. A few drops spilled across the counter, leaving dark stains on the white surface. No one in the room dared to move. They all felt something shifting, a silence not born of fear, but of an authority that needed no voice. Frank adjusted his cap, the faded emblem of the USMC barely visible through years of wear. The threads frayed the fabric, worn thin, like pages of a life chewed by time. Beneath the brim, his eyes looked straight ahead, neither angry nor bitter, just piercing, as if seeing through them to something farther, something they would never understand. In that gaze lived a battlefield fallen brothers, and an unfinished promise. And buried beneath it all, the exhaustion of a man who had watched his country forget the one thing that once defined it: respect. A dry leaf rolled past his boots, caught in the low wind. The gleam of Harley chrome shimmered across the glass window, the light quivering like ripples on water. One of the bikers drew a breath and forced a laugh, but the sound faltered midway, caught in his throat. The whole group grew uneasy, not from heat, but because the old man's silence was becoming a mirror, and what they saw reflected back was not strength, but their own pettiness. Frank's eyes moved toward the gas pumps, where a sheen of oil glimmered like thin blood under the sun. The sight took him back to that red-soaked sand years ago, where his brothers fell and where he swore no one would ever mock the flag, or the name Marine while he still breathed. He was never a man of words. He had learned long ago that speeches saved no one, only actions did. So he stood there motionless, a statue carved from memory. Behind him, the glass door creaked open. The soft chime broke the still surface of silence. Frank didn't turn, but his spine straightened. The wind stopped. For one brief heartbeat, the world held its breath. A reflection appeared on the door's glass, tall, steady, unhurried. The sound of boots striking the floor came measured, deliberate. A second breath entered the room, deep calm, composed, threading through the air, like balance returning to a tilted scale. The cashier's head lifted slightly. He didn't know why, but relief washed over him. The room suddenly had weight again, a calm center, like someone had quietly reset the balance of right and wrong in the world. Frank stayed silent. He knew who had just arrived, though he hadn't looked. It was the same instinct he once had on the battlefield, when the sound of an approaching helicopter told him that help was near. You didn't need to see it. You just knew. The wind returned, carrying the smell of gasoline and dust. The flag above the station stretched tight, fluttering once as if saluting what was about to unfold. And from that very moment when the stranger stepped across the threshold, the story was no longer between a veteran and a gang of bikers. It became a story between honor and forgetfulness. Biker 1, nice outfit, old man. Playing hero today, huh? Biker 2, where'd you buy those medals? A pawn shop. Laughter burst out thick with the stench of beer and cigarettes. The coarse sound tore through the still air like a knife against glass. Frank didn't answer. He simply nodded calm and kept walking toward the counter. His hand gripped the wooden cane, his steps slow and steady. "Frank, I just need to pay for my gas, gentlemen." His voice was calm, every word measured the tone of a man who once gave orders under fire. But that composure only fueled their laughter. Biker 1. "Hear that, so polite?" Biker 2. "Careful, Grandpa. Wouldn't want you to fall." A sudden kick. The cane flew from his hand and hit the floor with a dry, sharp sound. Frank staggered, catching himself on a shelf. A soda can rolled away, spinning to a stop. His metals clinked together, the metallic sound clear piercing, then faded like an echo from a battlefield only he could still hear. Sunlight cut through the window, landing on his faded green jacket. The ribbons on his chest, their colors dulled by decades, were fragments of blood sand and promises never broken. He bent to pick up his cane. His hand trembled, but his eyes stayed sharp, steady, unflinching, and cold as stone. One of the bikers leaned closer, brushing a finger against the metals with mocking curiosity. Biker 3. "These real old man, or just props to show off?" Frank looked at him, no anger, no disdain. Only the look of someone who had seen men like this collapse in terror when things turned real. It was enough to make the biker flinch, stepping half a pace back without knowing why. Behind the counter, the cashier, Tyler, tried to find his voice. "Tyler. Hey, maybe you guys should stop." No one listened. The laughter rose again, uglier this time. They loved the power of humiliation, especially when aimed at an old man wearing symbols they didn't understand. Frank drew a long breath. He wasn't in the gas station anymore. In a blink, the light turned into gunfire. The laughter blended with explosions. He was back on the red hills of Da Nang smoke sand, the acrid smell of gunpowder. Voices shouting through chaos, Miller. "Hold the line." The sound of metals clinking brought him back to the present. He straightened, gripping the cane tightly. "Frank, you don't know what you're doing." It wasn't a threat. It was grief. Grief for a generation that had forgotten how to bow their heads to the people who once protected them. Razor, the gang leader, stepped forward. Tattoos crawled up his wrist, arrogance burning in his eyes. "Razor, what are you going to do, old man? Call your buddies to save you." He smirked, his breath heavy with beer and smoke. The wind shifted, slapping the flag above the station so hard it cracked in the air. Frank didn't move. His eyes stayed locked, gray-blue, cold as tempered steel. Razor hesitated for a fraction of a second, something inside him, warning of danger, but pride pushed him closer. The only sound left was the metal sign outside clattering in the wind. Tyler held his breath. Through the glass door, a stranger had stopped watching. His silhouette fell across the floor like a dividing line between light and shadow. Frank planted his cane on the ground, shoulders squared. His voice came low, rough but steady. "Frank, I've met bigger men than you." They laughed too. Then they stayed behind. No one spoke. The words weren't a challenge. They were truth, the kind only those who'd seen war could understand. The wind changed again. Gas fumes mixed with the dust, stinging the air. For a moment, everything stopped, sound, movement, even breath. Tyler's eyes lifted toward the door. A man was stepping inside, tall, calm, in a black t-shirt and dark sunglasses. His pace was measured, deliberate. No one knew who he was, but everyone felt it, the shift. The air, the rhythm, even the light, all different now. And from that moment on, the silence in the room no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the storm that was about to arrive. The glass door eased open, the soft jingle of a bell breaking through the dense silence. A man stepped inside. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply stopped at the threshold, his black boots carrying the dust of the road. Sunlight bounced off his dark sunglasses, then vanished when he took them off. His face was revealed, not young, not old. Calm as still water, yet in his eyes lived a quietness only those who had been where fear no longer existed could carry. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, every step placed with intention, as if each movement was measured long before it happened. No one knew who he was. Black t-shirt, jeans, empty hands. No uniform, no insignia, no introduction. But there was something in his posture that changed the rhythm of the room. Frank stood motionless. A faint chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but recognition. The measured gait, the contained precision. It was the movement of someone trained, someone who knew the boundaries of silence. The stranger's footsteps echoed evenly across the tile floor. Each step felt like a countdown to something inevitable. The bikers glanced at one another. One shifted uneasily, the primal instinct of caution rising without reason. The man stopped 10 paces from Frank. He said nothing, just observed. His eyes swept across each face, cataloging every detail: the smell of beer, the twitch of hands, the metallic glint inside leather jackets. He missed nothing. One of the bikers frowned, his chin lifting in challenge. "Biker 2. Who the hell are you? What do you want?" The stranger didn't answer. He didn't even blink. His silence wasn't empty. It carried weight, pressing down on the air until it felt hard to breathe. Razor let out a dry, nervous chuckle. "Razor, private conversation, pal. Keep moving." Still, the man didn't move. He only removed his gloves, slid them into his pocket, his gaze never leaving Frank. To Tyler, the young cashier, it looked as though he was assessing a battlefield, not a gas station. Outside, the wind shifted, suddenly tugging the curtain beside the door. The air thickened with gasoline, sweat, tobacco, and beer. A bead of sweat rolled down Razor's temple. He turned, forcing a smirk, trying to shake off the unease crawling up his neck. "Razor. Hey, old man, that your buddy or your bodyguard?" Frank didn't answer, but in his eyes flickered something rare, a flash of recognition mixed with the relief of understanding. He knew this kind of man. He didn't need a name. The eyes said enough. A younger biker raised his voice, though it cracked halfway through. "Biker 3. Yo, what are you staring at, huh?" The stranger stayed silent. Then in one sharp motion, his gaze shifted toward the kid, quick, precise, like a blade slicing through air. The biker froze where he stood, as if struck by something invisible. The rest stiffened instinctively. Metal clinked softly as someone tightened their grip on a chain. Tyler swallowed hard, his hand falling away from the phone behind the counter. No one had told them to stop, but somehow everyone knew they should. A silence spread through the room, like an electric current starting from the stranger, passing to Frank, then to the gang that had been roaring with laughter only moments ago. Frank picked up his cap again, straightened its worn fabric. He lifted his head, locking eyes with the stranger. They didn't speak, but in that shared look was something unspoken mutual recognition between two men who had once stood on the same side of history. The stranger tilted his chin slightly, then stopped, his eyes turning to Razor. Only a few steps separated them now, yet no one dared to move forward. The air thickened. Even the hum of the air conditioner and the noise from the road outside seemed to die away. No one in the room was laughing anymore. Those eyes stripped away the gang's false bravado. They no longer saw an old man before them, but two soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, one a symbol of the past, the other the embodiment of the present. Both carried an authority that demanded silence. Tyler stepped back, heart pounding. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct told him something irreversible was about to unfold. Outside sunlight angled through the window, striking the metals on Frank's chest. The light flashed, glinting off the stranger's eyes, a brief flare enough to draw every gaze toward it. No one spoke, but all understood the silence was about to break. And when that man finally opened his mouth with just one quiet sentence, the truth began to surface like a spark slipping into a storm, waiting to ignite. "Walker, those medals are real. I recognize the 3rd Battalion ribbon." His voice was calm, deep, and clear, carrying through the room like an order that didn't need to be shouted. No one laughed now. No one dared to speak. Frank turned toward him, his eyes glinting surprise, giving way to recognition. "Frank, Afghanistan or Iraq?" A brief silence. "Walker, both. 75th Rangers." The answer was short and sharp. No bragging, no story, just truth clean and cold as a blade. Frank nodded slowly. Their eyes met. 2 generations, 2 wars connected by the same unspoken language. That simple nod was more than acknowledgement. It was a salute, quiet and sacred, shared between men who understood the cost of surviving. The air in the room changed. Razor swallowed hard. Sweat dampened the back of his shirt, but he forced a grin that had already lost its confidence. "Razor, we were just joking, Colonel. Nothing serious." Walker, he wasn't joking when he earned those. He earned them defending people who couldn't defend themselves. Walker's eyes shifted, his tone deepening, each word measured like a drumbeat. "Walker, you should apologize and leave." The sentence wasn't loud, but it carried weight heavy as the sound of a final gunshot. No one moved. The silence now felt ceremonial. Razor turned aside, forcing a dry chuckle, but his fist clenched at his side. He couldn't stand being diminished before his men, and worse by someone whose name he had read in the headlines years ago. Biker 2 muttered under his breath, "Did he just say—" "Colonel Biker 3 Rangers. I heard those guys don't mess around." The whispers barely carried, but they were enough to strip the last of the group's bravado. Walker stepped closer. Light from the door framed his face, catching the thin scar that ran down his temple. He didn't need to say anything more. The scar said enough. They understood now this was a man who had seen things they would never have the courage to face. Frank's voice came soft, steady. "Frank, you still serve Walker Numb, but a soldier never really leaves the line." Frank smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when faith quietly returns after being gone too long. Razor stood frozen, his eyes shifting between defiance and fear. He forced himself to stand tall, clinging to whatever pride he had left. "Razor, there's 5 of us here, and 1 of you, Walker. 1's enough." The words landed slow and calm, no threat in the tone, yet they hit like the click of an unseen safety being released. Biker 1 took a half step back. Biker 2 glanced toward the door where sunlight stretched long across the row of pumps. No one was laughing anymore. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Behind the counter, Tyler hovered over the phone, ready to call the cops, then stopped. There was something in Walker's voice, something absolute that told him he wouldn't need to. Frank straightened. His gaze locked on Razor. There was no anger there, only sorrow. "Frank, you don't need to know who I am. Just understand everything you're standing on was paid for in blood." Razor lowered his head, not from fear, but from the sudden realization of how small he truly was. Walker turned slightly, his voice dropping firm and final. "Walker, that's enough. Leave before you regret staying." A gust of wind slammed against the glass door, making the open sign clatter violently. Outside, the sky thickened to gray, and from the distance came the deep, synchronized rumble of engines, steady, powerful, and drawing closer. Biker 3 peered toward the window, his face paling. "Biker 3 Razor." "You hear that?" Razor said nothing. He looked from Walker to Frank, 2 men standing in the heavy quiet, still and unyielding like monuments carved from steel. And then the sound of those engines swelled, surrounding the station. Headlights flashed across the glass like 100 watching eyes opening at once to witness what was about to happen next. The rumble of engines echoed outside, low, steady, unhurried. 15 motorcycles rolled in perfectly aligned, not in chaos, but in formation. Sunlight slid across their black chrome frames like rivers of molten metal. The ground beneath the gas station trembled softly under the weight of that sound, a sound not of threat, but of discipline. On their backs gleamed the emblem of the Veterans Motorcycle Association, a silver shield bearing the American flag with a single line beneath it. Brothers then, brothers now. Every rider carried the calm composure of someone who had survived places where safety did not exist. Engines clicked off in unison. Silence followed, solemn, reverent, almost sacred. The glass door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped down from the lead bike. Short hair, black leather jacket pinned with a Navy insignia. Her spine straight, her gaze unwavering. She walked inside, each step measured precise, as if trained to calculate distance. No one in the room moved. She stopped in front of Walker, her voice sharp and clear, a command wrapped in respect. "Reyes, Colonel Walker, sir." Her hand rose in salute, crisp and perfect. The air froze. Every eye in the room turned to the 2 figures standing side by side, one a former Ranger officer, the other carrying the quiet authority of command. The gang that had once mocked now stood motionless, their bravado dissolving. The word colonel hung in the air like a thread, pulling them all back into reality. They weren't facing a stranger anymore, but a commander. Walker returned the salute with a brief nod, then turned his eyes toward Frank. For a moment, time itself slowed. The flag outside stiffened in the wind, sunlight striking Frank's faded metals, and suddenly they glowed again, as if memory itself refused to die. Reyes followed that glint with her eyes, her voice softening into reverence. "Reyes, Staff Sergeant Franklin Miller. It's really you." Frank blinked, startled, unsure how to react. "Frank, you know me, Reyes. I've read your file. Da Nang, 1968. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. You held your position for 3 hours while your unit was surrounded." The room fell utterly silent. Her tone wasn't one of praise, but of absolute respect. The same men who had laughed at him earlier now stood frozen hands slack at their sides, eyes fixed on the floor. Walker turned toward them, his voice low and hard as steel. "Walker, That's why you never laugh at a medal. Every piece of metal on that chest was paid for in blood. No one replied. Only the wind answered, whistling faintly through the cracks of the door, carrying the scent of gasoline and dust. Behind the counter, Tyler swallowed his throat tight. He understood this was no longer a confrontation. This was something larger, something sacred. Reyes turned to the road demons, her eyes steady. Reyes' honor doesn't need an introduction. It appears the moment a man knows when to bow his head. She removed her cap, stood tall, and called out, "Reyes, salute, gentlemen." Outside, every veteran on a bike lifted a hand in unison. Their leather jackets shifted with one movement, unified, deliberate, disciplined. The clock on the wall ticked once, a single sharp click, as if marking the moment when the entire room fell still, leaving behind only the sound of reverence. Frank lowered his head slightly, his hand brushing the brim of his worn marine cap. He wasn't used to such recognition. In his aged eyes, the reflection of light was more than pride. It was remembrance for those who no longer stood to receive the same salute. Razor's head hung low, his tattooed hands trembling faintly. He couldn't look at Frank. He thought of his grandfather, also a Vietnam veteran, who'd come home with eyes that never smiled again. And now he understood, even without words, that he had mocked the most sacred thing a man could possess, loyalty and sacrifice. Walker stepped forward half a pace, his tone solemn, final. Walker titles may fade, but the men who carried them never will. Reyes nodded once in quiet agreement. Frank responded with a small smile, his gaze drifting past them all out the window to where sunlight fell over rows of parked motorcycles standing like an honor guard. And as silence settled once more, something ancient stirred, not a memory of war, but a memory of gratitude rising quietly from the hearts of those who had once lowered their heads in shame. Walker Staff Sergeant Franklin Miller, Da Nang, 1968. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He held the line when everyone else fell. His voice rang clear, not loud, but carrying the gravity of a vow. The whole room seemed to stop breathing. Wind swept dust and sunlight through the gas station windows, folding into the silence that had settled heavy, reverent, unbreakable. Frank lowered his head slightly, not out of pride, but remembrance. He could see the faces again, young men who never left Da Nang. Light slipped across the ribbons on his chest, and for a moment, they glowed as if rekindled after half a century of being forgotten. Out of that silence came a voice, rough and uncertain, Razor. "You said Da Nang. My grandfather was there. In Vietnam." Walker turned eyes cold and sharp. Walker. What was his name? Razor swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. Razor Thomas Maddox. He never came home. Frank froze. That name, he knew it. For a long moment, no one spoke. His eyes drifted away, reaching back into the smoke and chaos of 1968. Frank Maddox. Radio operator, 25th Infantry. I didn't know him personally, but I heard the stories. He held the comm line through the entire assault. Your grandfather was a hero, son. Razor didn't answer. His throat tightened, and the laughter that had filled this place minutes ago vanished, replaced by something raw and painful. His shoulders trembled. Razor. I didn't know. No one ever told me. My father never talked about the war. He just said, the country forgot them. Frank nodded slowly. Frank, it wasn't the country that forgot. It's that people are afraid to remember the things that make them feel small. Razor lifted his head, eyes red. Behind him, the rest of the road demons stood still, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The same hands that had clenched chains and fists now hung loose by their sides. The silence that filled the room was no longer tense. It was penitent. Reyes stepped forward, her voice firm but gentle. Reyes, this Sunday, there's a memorial at the Veterans Center. Your grandfather's name belongs on that wall. You should come. Razor said nothing, then nodded slow, heavy, sincere. His eyes brimmed as he looked at Frank again, the words trembling out. Razor, I'm sorry. For everything. Frank's response was quiet, his hand resting on the young man's shoulder. Frank, you don't need to say it. Regret isn't spoken, it's lived. Sunlight flooded through the glass, washing away the thick, stale air. The faint haze of gasoline faded in the warmth, replaced by something else, respect. Stillness filled the room, clean and calm like the first morning after a war. Walker stepped back, leaving a space between Frank and the gang. No one here was an enemy anymore. They were simply men, different generations, different scars, standing under the same flag. Behind the counter, Tyler stood watching, eyes wide and bright. He'd never truly understood what the word veteran meant until this moment. He saw now that in the silence between them, there was a strength greater than any weapon. Frank tightened his grip on the wooden cane, his gaze lifting toward the blazing horizon. Frank, they stayed behind, so we could stand here and make it right. No one replied, but every man in that room understood. Reyes bowed her head, her voice soft and reverent. Reyes, thank you. Staff Sergeant, for reminding us what's truly worth kneeling for. Frank smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when a man finds faith in the world again. Outside, the wind rose once more, carrying the scent of fuel and sun-warmed earth, weaving through a silence now light and pure. And in that moment, as the men who once mocked bowed before quiet courage, something unseen began to take root, something that would make sure this small town never again looked at its veterans as relics of the past, but as the living heart of its honor. A month later, the old gas station had transformed completely. Where once stood cracked concrete and faded paint, a new memorial wall now rose from the eastern corner, lined with photographs of the town's veterans. Black and white portraits, worn and fading, captured the faces of young soldiers in uniform, bright-eyed rifles on their shoulders, now resting quietly behind glass preserved in time. At the very center of the wall hung a single-color photograph. Frank Miller, Colonel Walker, Commander Reyes, and Razor Maddox. 4 lives joined by one moment of redemption. Beneath it, engraved carefully into a bronze plaque, were the words, "The chain of service never breaks." That chain of service, it had never broken and never would. People from the town began visiting often. They brought flowers, small flags, sometimes photographs of fathers, brothers, and sons who had once served. Tyler, the young cashier, now cared for the memorial. Every morning he wiped the glass, cleaned, straightened, tilted frames, and sometimes paused before Frank's photograph, silent for a few seconds, as if listening for that calm, gravelly voice once more. Razor came every week. The beard was gone, the leather jacket replaced by a plain shirt, with a new insignia, the 25th Infantry Division, pinned neatly over his heart. He spoke little now. He simply helped Tyler rearrange photos or replace wilted flowers. Some mornings he stood quietly for a long time before the picture of his grandfather, Thomas Maddox, now among the honored dead. One late afternoon, when the sun turned the road to gold, Frank arrived. He walked slowly, his wooden cane tapping softly on the concrete. The air carried the mixed scent of gasoline and coffee, the smell of years past. Razor was already there. When he saw Frank, he straightened, lowering his head in quiet respect. Frank smiled gently. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small cloth bundle. Inside lay an old silver pin dulled by age. He placed it into Razor's palm. Frank, the best way to honor them is to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. Razor closed his fingers around the pin, his eyes glistening. He couldn't speak, only knotted his throat tight. In the fading sunlight, the 2 men stood side by side, one who had fought and one who had learned what it meant to remember. Both silent, both looking toward the wall. Reyes stepped out from the station carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Frank, the other to Razor. Reyes, this Sunday, we're holding a small service for the veterans. We'd like you to say a few words, Staff Sergeant. Frank smiled faintly. Frank, I've said enough in this life. Now it's time to listen. Walker wasn't there that day, but the letter he sent rested inside a frame in the corner of the wall. His handwriting trembled slightly. Some battles never end, they just change form. Visitors often paused before it, nodding quietly, as if they understood. When the sun dipped behind the hills, its last light poured through the glass, glinting against the engraved bronze words. Each letter shimmered for a heartbeat, like a silent oath passed down through generations. People walking by stopped and bowed their heads. No plaque or speech was needed. Everyone knew what this place meant. It belonged to those who had given the best parts of themselves so others could live in peace. Frank brushed his hand across the glass, resting it on the photo, where his own face smiled back at him beside his friends. He turned to Razor. Frank, now you're the keeper of the flame. Don't let it die. Razor, never, sir. Outside, the evening sky deepened to bronze and crimson. Dry leaves drifted past the memorial wall as the distant sound of motorcycles rolled through the air, steady unified the heartbeat of a nation that had not forgotten its own. Frank sat down on the bench beside the wall, his hand resting on his cane. The sunset light fell through the glass, glowing across his face. He spoke softly, almost a prayer. Frank, they're not gone. They just went home before we did. The world fell silent once more. Only the wind remained and the light gleaming across the bronze letters, the chain of service never breaks. Beneath those words, the reflection of Frank Razor and the bowed townsfolk shimmered together, a chain of service that no longer belonged to soldiers alone, but to the very soul of the people who remembered them. Brave veteran stories, we remember the quiet heroes.